The concepts of nanotechnology are not inherently new to nature or to the history of mankind. Science and nature have taught us that biological systems are built using small cells and proteins that follow an intrinsic plan dictated by infinitesimally small genetic coding. About 2,000 years ago, ancient Greeks and Romans used sulfide nanocrystals as hair dye. As shown in right picture, you can find the color variation of the dye. The color could be controlled by the size of sulfide nanocrystal. It is interesting that many of chemicals used in hair shop-in nowadays are sulfide. For example, permanent curling is driven by sulfide bonding in hair proteins. An extraordinary work with glass made by the Romans in the 4th or 5th century AD demonstrates one of the greatest examples of nanotechnology in the ancient world. The Lycurgus cup, which is part of the collection of the British Museum, shows King Lycurgus being dragged to the underworld by Ambrosia. Surprisingly, when lit outside the cup looks green. When lit from inside the cup looks reddish and the King Lycurgus looks purple. The explanation for this phenomenon was obtained only in 1990 after scientists analyzed the cup using an atomic force microscope. It was found that the dichroism, which means two colors, is observed due to the presence of nanoparticles, 66.2% silver, 31.2% gold, and 2.6% copper, up to 100 nanometer in size, dispersed in a glass matrix. The red color observed is a result of absorption of light at 520 nanometer wavelength by the gold particles. The purple color results due to the absorption by the larger particles, while the green color is attributed to the light scattering by colloidal dispersions of silver particles with size larger than 40 nanometers. The Lycurgus cup is recognized as one of the oldest synthetic nanocomposites. The Lycurgus cup has now assumed an almost iconic status in the nanomaterial field as an early example of the surface plasmon phenomenon, in which waves of electrons move along the surface of metal particles when light is incident onto them. Analyses have demonstrated that the glass in the Lycurgus cup contains rather small amounts of gold powder embedded within it on the order of 40 parts per million. These tiny metallic particles suspended within the glass matrix have diameters comparable to the wavelengths of visible light. As a consequence, a form of plasmonic excitation can occur. An oscillation of the free electrons at the surface of a metal particle at a certain frequency. We will explore in detail later on the plasmon. Light reflections are enhanced as the waves are highly absorbed and scattered, reducing transmission. This absorption has an orientational dependence. Interestingly, other colors aside from the red and green seen in the Lycurgus cup could be achieved by altering metal particle sizes. In the cup, however, color properties depend primarily on reflection when the light is external to the cup and on absorption and transmission when the light source is internal. Besides the Romans, medieval artisans also explored the effect of the addition of metal particles in glass to create stained glass windows. A well-documented and early example of a man-made nanoprocess is the work of medieval stained glass makers who used small nano-size gold particles of varying sizes to create the different color hues found in stained glass windows of medieval churches and structures. Hence, gold particles display a different form of color depending on their size at the nanoscale. Gold at the larger scale, the macroscale, such as a gold brick, reflects the well-known yellowish color. On the left corner of the slide, you can find figures showing some examples of how gold and silver nanoparticles of different sizes were applied to stained glass windows. For example, red color is from 20 nanometer diameter gold nanoparticles, while orange color is from 80 nanometer diameter gold nanoparticles. In the 15th to 17th century, Metal clusters were used to make some structural color which is called iridescence in specific china. This china is called Daruta pottery. Because of the high surface energy and aggregating propensity of small nanoparticles, the synthesis of small, monodispersed nanoparticles, including gold nanoparticles, has been a major challenge in nanotechnology. Even though gold nanoparticles were utilized in the medieval period, the modern era of gold nanoparticles is believed to have started 160 years ago with Michael Faraday's Bakerian lecture of the Royal Society, Experimental Relations of Gold, and Other Metals, to Light. By chemical means, Faraday produced a beautiful ruby fluid and realized that it contained suspended gold particles too small to be seen by the naked eye. This phenomenon, later defined as the Faraday-Tyndall effect, is observed when a colloidal fluid is illuminated by a beam of light. In 2003, J. M. Thomas demonstrated Faraday's hypothesis using high-resolution transmission electron microscopy. Actually, nowadays, gold nanocrystals are being synthesized in the lab using a similar recipe as Faraday used. The colloidal metal nanoparticles have been widely used to prepare noble metallic plasmonic nanostructures. These nanostructures are still popular for performance enhancement of energy materials such as solar cells, chemical materials such as catalyst, display materials or imaging agent, and biological materials such as photothermal materials. We will cover more about metal nanoparticles in the second lecture. There is another great achievement in the later 19th century, which is the development of electromagnetic wave theory by Scottish physicist James Maxwell. Maxwell combined seeming different four phenomena concerning electricity and magnetism in a set of beautifully organized mathematical equations. These equations are further simplified by British mathematical Heaviside. If you are familiar with undergraduate-level electromagnetics, you have experienced how to derive wave equations such as Helmholtz equation from the Maxwell equations. From the wave equation, surprisingly, Maxwell equation predicted the identity of light as electromagnetic wave. This identity was experimentally proved by German physicist Hertz in later 19th century. Maxwell equation supported by Hertz's experiment paved a way to understand light as wave and wave-related mechanics. In the early of 20th century, German physicist Albert Einstein suggested a theory on the Brownian motion. Although Einstein is famous for his special relativity and general relativity theories, he was awarded by Nobel Prize for Physics in recognition his contribution to the photoelectric effects. However, he also contributed to the atomic model. In the year 1905, Einstein suggested a mathematical model explaining diffusion as a random walk of small particles. His model could successfully explain Brownian motion, and conclusively support the realistic existence of the atom itself. This theory made a direct substrate on which the atom model can stand. Although not mentioned in the slide, I would like you to remember another great scientist who made a basic pedestal on which nanotechnology could prosper. His name is Ludwig Boltzmann. His is a father of the statistical physics and thermodynamics. Using the mathematically organized theory, Boltzmann conceptualized entropy and the second law of thermodynamics. The thermodynamics is one of the most profound fundamental principles which governs the world at nanoscale. Therefore, it is important to learn about statistical physics for better understanding the physics and chemistry at nanoscale. In the early 20th century, there were great moments to remember in the history of nanotechnology. Using Maxwell's electromagnetic wave theory, German physicist Gustav Mie developed a mathematical theory which can explain light scattering from very small particles. Light scattering can be categorized into three types. The classification is done by the ratio of light wavelength and the size of the particles which scatter the light. If the size of the particles is sufficiently smaller than the wavelength of light, the light scattering can be considered as electromagnetic field affected by mean field-like dielectric constant given by the particles. This scattering is called as Rayleigh scattering. If the size of the particles is sufficiently larger than the wavelength of light, the scattering is equivalent to the geometrical reflection of light from the surface of the particles. The most difficult scenario of the scattering is the case in which size of the particles is similar to the wavelength of light. In this case, space occupied by particle cannot be ignored. Therefore, electromagnetic wave equation should be solved in three-dimensional space around the particles. Me developed the mathematical theory for this. And the light scattering for this case is called Me scattering. This theory can explain the evening glow in leftmost picture. Actually, the change of sky color at sunset, red nearest the sun, blue furthest away, is caused by Rayleigh scattering by atmospheric gas particles, which are much smaller than the wavelengths of visible light. The gray, white color of the clouds is caused by Me scattering by water droplets, which are of a comparable size to the wavelengths of visible light. In 1931, Dr. Ruska first developed electron microscope. This microscope could observe few micron features which had not been observed by optical microscope. Considering a fact that typical size of cells is smaller than 10 micrometers, electron microscope is most adequate method to look into the cellular world. In 1938, American physicist Erwin Langmuir with Blodgett developed the first two-dimensional film which is called Langmuir-Blodgett film. The film was prepared by a device called Langmuir trough. Once suspended on the surface of liquid, some particles are assembled due to their attractive interaction. However, too close physical distance among the particles is prevented by the repulsive force given by entropic effects such as exclusive volume effect or enthalpic effects such as elastic energy cost. Using Langmuir trough, the suspended nanoparticles can form equilibrium state of the assembly, and the assembly can be transferred into other substrate. In 1947, Bardeen, Stokely and Brattain co-invented the first electronic transistor. Ever since the development of the transistor, we have witnessed the dramatic progresses in microelectronics. In 1951, German physicist Dr. Müller made the first experimental observation of atoms using ion field electron microscope. This microscope is the first prototype of the field-enhanced electron microscope which is intensively used in nowadays. In 1953, British scientists Watson, Crick, and Wilkins made the first experimental observation of the double helix structure of DNA. The structure of DNA was not directly confirmed by electron microscope. Rather, the three scientists actively used X-ray diffraction. Due to the small wavelength of X-ray which ranges from 5 to 20 nanometers, X-ray can be used to investigate of the inner structure of materials with fine features. For example, DNA helix has 2 nanometers diameter. Therefore, it can be calculated how the structure would produce diffraction pattern when shed by X-ray. The realization that the structure of DNA is that of a double helix elucidated the mechanism of base pairing by which genetic information is stored and copied in living organisms and is widely considered one of the most important scientific discoveries of the 20th century. Crick, Wilkins, and Watson each received 1/3 of the 1962 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for their contributions to the discovery. In 1958, Japanese physicist Leo Isaki with Josephson and Giever made the first experimental observation of electron tunneling, which had been only theoretically predicted few decades ago by quantum mechanics. This experimental observation could support another important observation tool for the nano-world. It is scanning tunneling microscope and tunneling electron microscope. In 1959, American physicist Richard Feynman gave a famous lecture which was entitled as "There is Plenty of Room at the Bottom." We will find some more detailed meaning of this lecture in next slide. Feynman's stature as a Nobel laureate and as an important figure in 20th-century science helped advocates of nanotechnology and provided a valuable intellectual link to the past. In 1959 at American Physical Society meeting at Caltech, Professor Feynman gave a famous lecture. This lecture is very famous because in this lecture, Professor Feynman suggested very clear and visionary concepts and ideas of nanotechnology. He described his ideas as an invitation to enter a new field of physics. The lecture ignited several important concepts which opened the modern nanotechnology. First, he suggested the miniaturized computer. For the miniaturization, he suggested that the circuit should be very small with size less than 100 nanometers. For the nanoscale circuit, he also suggested to use 10 to 100 atoms wide nanowires. It is also surprising that his vision seems to be extended to the artificial intelligence. Ultimately, it is believed that Professor Feynman had a vision on the miniaturized but strong performance computer as the artificial intelligence with autonomous decision-making ability. Second, he suggested the better observation tool, which is better microscope. He suggested to use electron microscope, since the de Broglie wavelength of electrons can be reduced to the 1/20th of that of light. The subatom level resolution should open the new world into the atomistic devices. Indeed, Professor Feynman also suggested that we can control the atom. Literally, it would be possible to control or move a single atom and arrange the atoms to make some specific atomistic devices. This technology can be easily applied to atomistic devices which can process information at atomistic scale. Unfortunately, Professor Feynman dies in the 1980s and could not witness the emergence of atomistic computer by himself. However, his imagination and ideas have made a great impact on the development and design of a variety of nanomaterials and nanodevices. More concretely, his stature and concept of atomically precise fabrication played a role in securing funding for nanotechnology research, illustrated by President Clinton's January 2000 speech calling for a federal program. My budget supports a major new national nanotechnology initiative, worth $500 million. Caltech is no stranger to the idea of nanotechnology, the ability to manipulate matter at the atomic and molecular level. Over 40 years ago, Caltech's own Richard Feynman asked, what would happen if we could arrange the atoms one by one the way we want them? Feynman's ideas on the nanotechnology had succeeded to next-generation scientists such as Dr. Smalley and Dr. Drexler. In the later 20th century, more precise and more reliable technologies were developed which accelerated the development of nanotechnology. In the 1960s, NASA scientists developed ferrofluid, which is a colloidal solution of ferromagnetic nanoparticles such as iron oxide nanoparticles. The solution can respond to the external magnetic field, and therefore, can be used to control nanoscale position and make up nanoscale spaces. Nowadays, ferrofluids are employed in a variety of areas including speakers, vacuum pump, drug delivery carrier, and so on. In the mid of 1960, Gordon Moore, who is one of the founders of Intel, suggested an empirical law in semiconductor industry. This famous law is called as Moore's Law. This law has been worked as a rule of thumb to scale down the physical size of semiconductor devices while doubling up the calculation performances. It is Moore's law that made many people to access microelectronics and computer at relatively inexpensive cost. In the 1970s, Japanese scientist Professor Norio Taniguchi first coined the nanotechnology. He was chemist at Tokyo University of Science. He coined the nanotechnology terminology in his study on the processing of semiconductor thin films and materials. In 1974, Ratner and Aviram firstly realized the molecular electronics. This technology is the first experimental realization of molecular-scale electronic devices such as transistor. Their molecular electronics concept have been widely studied in a variety of areas such as organic solar cells, OLED, systems biology, synthetic biology, and even quantum computer. 3 years later, American chemist Professor Duyan at Northwestern University reported the first experimental observation of surface-enhanced Raman spectroscopy. This spectroscopy has been widely employed to observe nanoscale physical and chemical phenomena using Raman resonance or scattering of molecules and nanostructures. The Raman scattering is inelastic scattering of light from the materials. Due to a fact that the inelastic scattering is strongly dependent on the material's physicochemical properties, the scattering spectroscopy can provide detailed information on the materials. In particular, using micro-laser with beam size less than 100 nanometers and metallic nanostructures, Raman scattering can be dramatically enhanced near the surface of the materials in the vicinity of the metallic nanostructures. This is due mainly to the plasmonic near field derived by the metallic structures. We will cover detailed information on this scattering in Lecture 4. In 1981, two gentlemen, Gerd Binnig and Heinrich Rohrer of IBM Zurich, invented the scanning tunneling microscope, for which they later received the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1986. The scanning tunneling microscope works by sliding a very small tip, about the size of an atom, over a surface at an extremely close proximity, within a few atomic layers, and uses electronics to translate the surface topography into a visual image. This imaging tool relies on the quantum mechanical phenomena such as tunneling of electrons. The tunneling is not allowed in classical mechanics. However, due to wave-like identity of the electrons in the materials, electron can be transported from one place to other place across potential barrier. The transport probability dramatically increase with narrowing down the potential barrier width. In this manner, the scanning tunneling microscope produces a visual representation of the material being scanned, much like a key-cutting machine traces and makes a copy of the original key. In 1985, Harold Grotto from the University of Sussex, Robert Curl and Richard Smalley from Rice University discovered a new composition of carbon, carbon-60. This discovery made the three scientists be awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1996. This new compound, which only measures about 1 nanometer in diameter, was called a Buckminsterfree or buckyball. Carbon-60 has 60 carbon atoms covalently bonded and forming geometric 12 pentagons and 20 hexagons, the same geometric configuration found in most soccer balls. Buckyballs are produced through a low-pressure carbon vaporization process. The original technique only produced small quantities, but current processes produce carbon-60 or buckyballs at a much higher rate. Buckyballs are also used to form carbon nanotubes. These nanotubes can be used to form transistors and, Depending on their configuration, they can be made to be conductors or insulators. Carbon is a very interesting element because it has 4 electrons in its outer shell, just like silicon, and is allotropic, which means it can take on different forms. Both diamond and graphite are made from carbon. Carbon-60 was named after Richard Buckminster Fuller, who went by the nickname Bucky. Fuller's most noted architectural design was the geodesic dome. The geodesic dome is a sphere which is made up of geometric triangular shapes. It is a very rigid construction and very strong in terms of its weight to volume. The C-60 buckyball was named in Fuller's honor. In 1986, American scientist Eric Drexler wrote a book entitled Engines of Creation. In this book, the concept of molecular machinery was firstly coined by Dr. Drexler. Actually, Drexler obtained his doctoral degree after publishing the book at MIT Media Lab in 1991. On the right, you can find a simplified motion picture of one of the representative molecular motors made of proteins and other nanomaterials. In the same year, IBM physicists Binig, Quat and Jerby developed atomistic force microscope. This microscope was similar to its previous tool scanning tunneling microscope. However, atomic force microscope could obtain high-resolution atomistic scale image of the materials and films using short-range atom-to-atom attractive interaction. You can find one of the representative atomistic image of molecules of some aromatic compounds obtained by AFM on the right. In 1988, American chemist Professor Louis Spruce at Columbia University reported the first experimental synthesis of quantum dots. As many of you have already heard about it, quantum dots have been actively utilized for a wide range of applications such as luminescence materials, sensing materials, catalyst, and imaging agent. Nowadays, quantum dots have been actively investigated for the candidate to produce single photon at nanoscale systems. The single photon can deliver digital information in itself. When combined with spintronics, which utilizes the quantum mechanical information of single electron, the single photon can work as a signal for the quantum computer. Therefore, more and more studies will be focused on the development of reliable quantum dots as the single photon transducer. In the 1990s, scientists developed very interesting nanoscale materials. In 1991 and 1993, Japanese scientist Sumio Idema reported first experimental synthesis of carbon nanotube. As shown on the right, there are 2 classes of carbon nanotube. The first one is single-wall nanotube and the second one of multi-wall carbon nanotube. Although, these 2 classes of the nanotubes are commonly composed only of carbon atoms, their physical and chemical properties are quite different. These differences are due mainly to the electronic structure of the carbon materials with confined geometry. Even for the single-wall carbon nanotube, the electronic structure can be varied by the chirality of the nanotube lattice. This chirality difference can lead the nanotube to be metal or semiconductor. When incorporated with topological defects, the carbon nanotube can work as even an insulator. We will explore detailed information on this difference in the second lecture. In 1996, American chemists Chad Merkin at Northwestern University developed self-assembled monolayer and its connection to gold colloids. DNA is composed of 4 different nucleobases, and 2 of them make strong covalent bond to each other and produce complementary pairs. For example, guanine and cytosine are coupled. Adenine and thymine are coupled. Using these paired coupling of the nucleobases, genetically engineered DNA molecules can be used as a glue to guide the assembly of the DNA-coded GOTA nanoparticles. These nanomaterials have been actively used for drug delivery, nanobiosensors, display materials, and nanoscale sequencing platforms. In the 21st century, the United States launched its science program focusing on nanotechnology, namely National Nanotechnology Initiative. In 2004, British scientist Andrei Novoselov made the first experimental observation of two decarbonaceous materials, namely graphene. They won Nobel Prize for Physics 6 years later. In 2005, a spin-off startup company stemming from Oxford University, Oxford Nanopore, developed a biotechnological system for the fast sequencing based on nanopore sequencing. In this sequencing system, nanoscale pores in the membrane work as a selective classifier for bases of DNA and RNA. In 2017, Dubochet, Frank, and Henderson were awarded Nobel Prize for Chemistry for the development of cryo-EM for observation of biomolecules. Before getting to next content, I invite all of you to know more about Dr. Drexler as the next generation visionary after Dr. Feynman. Eric Drexler's first book, Engines of Creation, first published in 1986, popularized the futuristic possibilities of nanotechnology. Engines of Creation covered everything from artificial intelligence to self-replicating machines to the use of nanotechnology to cure infectious diseases and repair damaged cells. Drexler also talked about how nanotechnology could be used to extend human lifespan, by placing people in suspended animation when they die so that they can later be brought back to life once a cure was found. Drexler also discussed how humans would be able to populate civilizations away from Earth, on near planets or in space stations. Drexler talked about the dangers of nanotechnology and specifically mentioned the gray goo phenomena. Gray goo is the term given to the potential problem of self-replicating and autonomous artificial intelligence machines that can take over the world and wipe out life as we know it today. This is a doomsday theory also called ecophagy, where artificial intelligence machines multiply uncontrollably and spread much like bacteria until they consume all resources of Earth and turn the Earth itself into gray goo. Drexler wrote, "Dangerous replicators could easily be too tough, small, and rapidly spreading to stop, at least if we made no preparation. By working along molecule by molecule and structure by structure, repair machines will be able to repair whole cells. By working along cell by cell and tissue by tissue, they will be able to repair whole organs. They will restore health." Cell repair machines. Drexler also wrote about cell repair machines. These machines would be about the size of bacteria but would be more sophisticated since their internal parts would be more intricate and they would be controlled via a program inside a tiny microcomputer. This artist's rendition shows a cell repair machine which was injected into the bloodstream in order to repair a damaged cell or remove it from the bloodstream. Cell repair machines will be able to identify damaged cells and repair them. Drexler wrote, "By working along molecule by molecule and structure by structure, repair machines will be able to repair whole cells. By working along cell by cell and tissue by tissue, they will be able to repair whole organs. They will restore health." Now we have been through a short but also long history of nanotechnology. Here is a brief summary for your information. On the left, you can find some important milestones for the development of nanotechnology. Please remember that the most of the scientists and engineers have not used nanotechnology term for their research. Nanotechnology stands on the shoulder of the basic science such as physics, chemistry, biology. With the help of the engineering such as materials science and electronic, mechanical engineering, chemical engineering, biological engineering. The scientific concept and theory concerning the nanotechnology could be realized. On the right, there are 3 representative carbonaceous nanomaterials which were synthesized in the course of the history of nanotechnology. In the second lecture, I will introduce nanomaterials including these materials.